three regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Or look at life expectancy in the world. Look at the two columns on the left-hand side. In Japan and Sweden, people can expect to live between 75 and 80 years. Look at the right-hand two columns. In Afghanistan, average life expectancy is 35. In Sierra Leone, it is 30. Can you imagine that? A difference of 45 years to live from people in the richest countries to people in the poorest countries. So as Christians, what do we think about this? I go back to the Bible and I first of all discover that God identifies with these 1.6 or 2.7 billion people. These are the people he mostly identifies with. The cause of the poor runs right the way through the scriptures. And ultimately the prophets tell us that our faithfulness to God is measured in substantial part by our actions towards the poor. In that passage that I read earlier from Jeremiah, Jeremiah is saying to the king, I'm sending you into exile for two reasons. The first reason is because you're idolatrous. You're not loving the Lord your God with all your heart. But the second reason is because of the way you treat the poor. You're not loving your neighbor as yourself. At least half the reason for Israel being thrown out of the promised land was because of their actions towards the poor. So what can we do? Well, $189 billion would help solve most of the world's hunger and poverty. One way we can have a tremendous influence is by influencing our own government if we're American citizens, or not even American citizens. The US has been called, along with every other country, to commit 0.07% of its budget to foreign aid. Do you know that the United States is probably the stingiest of all the advanced countries in the proportion of foreign aid that it gives? As a citizen, I can lobby my congressional representatives and senators and presidential candidates, and because of the internet, it's dead easy. You can get on any Senator Barack Obama's website, and it is dead easy to write an email in order to ask what does he think, or what is he doing in Congress to make sure that the United States is contributing its fair share to foreign aid. Let's turn then to global warming. I had a strange experience about a month ago. I was a visiting professor at the Australian National University, and I was talking to an authority on environmental regulation. And he said, I'm going to have a serious talk with you. Oh my goodness. What have I done? He said, I'd like you to consider working with me in the future on this problem of global warming. I said, I don't know anything about global warming. And so he then began to explain why he thought that my research and writing could actually transfer to global warming. So I've been thinking increasingly about global warming recently, and I'm glad to have this chance to talk about it a little bit here tonight. We apply exactly the same methodology. We first of all, this is what I've been doing actually as I've thought in the subsequent weeks. I first of all think about what is the issue. Why is it a problem? For whom is it a problem? And can we humans do anything about it? I then go back to the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about the environment? Do biblical ethics say anything about global warming, a concept that was not even remotely in the mind of the writers of the scriptures? If there is a biblical mandate, then what can and should I do? In the last week or two, many of you will have noticed that a panel called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations panel, has released perhaps the most authoritative report ever done on global warming. And its findings are extraordinary. Among other things, it says that in the area of water, drought-affected areas in the world are going to increase. The water that's currently stored in glaciers and in snow is very likely to decline, and that's going to reduce even more the water that's available for crops. And that's going to happen in areas where about 1/6 of the world's population lives, mostly in Africa and Asia. Here's an example of just one finding from this report. It says that the most vulnerable settlements are those settlements in coastal and river flood plains. Those floodplains are all over Asia. Here's an area near the delta of the Ganges on the Bay of Bengal. And in those areas and related areas, it's the poor communities that are especially vulnerable. Poor people tend to be concentrated in the worst places, places where there is going to be flooding. And the trouble is, when the floods come, they have less resources than you and I have in order to cope with them. They're also people who are much more sensitive to the pollution of local water supply and lack of food. In Africa, this report says there are going to be large increases in the number of people at risk of water scarcity, a problem that's already there now and is going to be greatly pronounced. Crop yields in areas where millions are already dying of starvation, it is estimated, are going to drop by 50% in the next 15 years. And imagine the starvation rates. In Asia, the glacier melting of the Himalayas is going to lead to floods and rock avalanches. See this picture here, a typical scene in Bangladesh in the height of a flood. Many of the world's most heavily populated coastal regions on rivers like the Ganges and the Mekong are going to experience increased flooding. Changes in temperature are going to reduce crop yields and increase the risk of hunger. The diseases that we talked about before related to diarrhea are going to rise even more dramatically than they are now. Now, what does the Bible have to say about this? For me, in the last few weeks, this has been a key issue. I told this scholar, I'm not interested in it unless there's some way that it connects with my Christian faith. But I wasn't too sure what the connection was. Well, we know from what we've already discovered that the Bible tells us we've got to uphold the poor and the oppressed, that we've got to rescue the weak and the needy, that we've got to oppose injustice of all forms. Don't you think it's tragic that in the last 200 or 300 years, we in the advanced countries have created much of the global warming effect, and who gets to suffer? The poorest people in the least developed countries. And so the BBC reporting on this report says people living in poverty are going to be the worst affected by the effects of climate change. Or as the chairman of this panel said, it's the poorest of the poor in the world who are going to be the worst hit. So what can we do? Well, in the kind of research that I do, we've discovered that the poor people of the world, the weak, when they work together, can actually make a big difference. Even individuals like us, who walk down Chicago Avenue